here. My name is Jacqueline Shaw. I'm assistant professor in architecture and department head of the Architecture and Urbanism at the Rhode Island School of Design. Very pleased to welcome you here this evening in collaboration with Providence Preservation Society to present Vishaan Chakrabarti and his talk, Getting to Goldilocks, Housing Communities, Building Neighborhoods and Preserving Nature. My remarks will be relatively brief, but I will say that when Marisa reached out over summer about the possibility of a partnered invitation, I reached out to several of my colleagues and we thought, wow, this is such a blessing to fall into my lap out of nowhere, because embedded within our curriculum, undergraduate and graduate programs, is the belief that engaging complexity at the urban scale prepares our students to be active citizens, with the understanding that architects not only contribute to, but they're central to the construction of just, equitable, and sustainable communities. In Providence Preservation Society's core values of stewardship, belief in community reinvestment, and advocacy for the whole city of Providence and its rich past and present, were a welcome, let's say, partner as a way to engage critical conversations such as this one today, as a way to support the construction of the creative visions for the city's future. I also wanted to thank Mayor Brett Smiley for being here as well, and want to note that as a tenet of not only his campaign, but his administration, is a commitment to the construction of affordable housing and its interconnected nature to affect and impact the general health, well-being of our families and children across the city. So thank you, and please, I want to just welcome Mayor Smiley.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline, and thank you for hosting us. This is RISD makes this space available from time to time, and it's such a beautiful renovation that was done here, and we're so pleased to be here. And RISD's been a great partner to the city. As many of you know, we renegotiated our agreements with the 4 private colleges in Providence, and RISD was a close party to all of that, and we're so glad to be in a productive place with the institution, and obviously everything that you do for the community. And thank you, Marisa and Kathy and everybody at PPS, for having this opportunity for us to hear from a national thought leader, Vishaan Chakrabarti. Thank you for joining us. It was nice. We were chit-chatting a little bit, and I love it when someone tells me how much they love Providence and everything we have going for it. I know all of you who live here, we already know that, but sometimes not enough people know that. And so it's an honor to have you here today. And we're on the heels of, actually last night, a very vibrant public hearing in our once-in-a-decade comprehensive plan rewrite. And so the service that PPS is providing tonight to help inform and hopefully inspire members of our community about these big topics around growth and neighborhood preservation. And as Vishaan and I were talking about earlier, sometimes all of us need to see it and not just hear it. And some of the work that he's done and hopefully will do tonight to help us all see how growth could occur and how we meet these goals going into the future is so important. And so it is a pleasure to be here tonight. We've got a couple of members of my planning staff, Joe Mulligan, Director of Planning and Development, Tim Shea, who's been doing all the community outreach for us. We're so glad that they'll be here throughout the evening to hear and learn and be inspired as well. As was mentioned, we are in fact facing a housing crisis here in Providence. It is a crisis that's driven by the fact that our population is expanding and the growth of housing stock is not expanding at a commensurate rate, and therefore prices are going up. And so it is good news, and maybe different than some of my colleague mayors around the country, where it's not a hard sell to convince people on Providence. People are moving here. What is becoming more difficult is finding available housing units for them. Right now, the city is, the apartment units are approximately 96% occupied. And that is what's driving costs, both on home ownership and on rentals. And so it is my goal, it is our goal as an administration to have housing options available at every price point, both home ownership and rental, deeply subsidized affordable and low-income housing, moderately subsidized workforce housing, and market rate housing. We need all of the above. And we're trying to take steps to address those. And so tonight, I hope and I expect that Vishaan will share a fresh perspective on how we can prepare as our population continues inevitably to expand. And we'll show, because we've reviewed some of his past work, that the solutions to this crisis are in fact within reach, but that they're going to require collaboration. So the role that PPS is playing, bringing people together, is part of that collaborative effort, and we're grateful for it. We are moving forward in the city on several fronts that we think can help meet this moment, that are also aligned with the vision that Vishaan has outlined in many places, not the least of which was his noted article in the New York Times, where he talked about outdated zoning regulations, the rising cost of construction, and the loss of key tax incentives, which were barriers to growth and development in New York City. And those very real challenges are here as well. And so we are tackling that here in Providence with an overhaul of our comprehensive plan, as was referenced, and then from there, zoning changes will come. A streamlining of the renewal process and reviewal process. We've totally overhauled our Department of Inspections and Standards and have made it easier to get plans approved. And we are working on incentives, which is the place where I think we've made the least amount of progress because of political cross currents and funding, but we know that that's an important piece of the process as well. Rising interest rates. We sit here this afternoon with a 0.5% rate cut that happened 2 hours ago, which will help and make a meaningful difference in what's happening. And then in real meaningful investments in affordable housing. Some of you might know that probably everybody knows that all cities around the country, Providence no different, received a tremendous amount of federal funding through the pandemic. When I took office a year and a half ago, we took a look at the previous allocation of those ARPA funds and did a line-by-line review to see what programs either weren't going to happen, weren't aligned with our priorities, and could be reprogrammed. And as a result, we took every available dollar we could find and put them into the city's Affordable Housing Trust Fund, which in our view was the best use of one-time federal funds to permanently create affordable housing options here in the city. We've been able to commit $55.6 million towards affordable housing in the city, which in a city of our size is a meaningful investment. And as a result, we've been able to create or preserve 1,600 permanently affordable housing units here in the city with those ARPA funds. We're working now to look at additional housing opportunities. We were talking briefly before we started about residential conversions in our downtown. We're also going to be doing more work to try to incentivize and change the economics around the proliferation of surface parking lots that we have in this city to see housing get developed on those lots. And we're going to need to pull a couple levers to change the math on those, but we're preparing to do that. And we're doing this in a way that we believe does not lose sight of what makes Providence special. And that's a little bit about what Vishaan talks about in his work, which is we can facilitate growth in an incremental way without destroying neighborhood character. And that's where we are in our comprehensive planning process. That's what we've been talking to residents about through our engagement session. I think Tim can correct me, but over the last 2 years, we've done 75. Is that the number? Higher. Tell me the number, Tim.
Probably around 82 now.
82 neighborhood listening sessions, community engagement sessions of various types to help inform that comprehensive plan. And as I mentioned, we had one public hearing last night. We will have a second public hearing in about a week and a half to finalize that once-in-a-decade plan. Through our redevelopment agency, the PRA, we have approved the creation or preservation of over 2,000 units, including 1,500 deed-restricted affordable units and 272 units of permanent supportive housing, and done this in a way that is sustainable. And this is a topic that comes up a lot. There is regular conversation about other ways to try to address the affordability crisis in our city. It's something that Vishaan writes about and I've spoken about. Artificially mandating things like rent control are not the solution for us. The solution for us are permanently subsidized affordable housing that is based upon tenants' ability to pay and income. And all of these housing units, these statistics that I've rattled off, have long-term funding in place. So this is something that is sustainable and will not distort the market. We're working on modernizing what locally we refer to as the 8% law, which is a tax credit available to affordable housing projects that has not kept pace with the time. For example, right now it is only on substantial rehabs, but doesn't apply to new construction. So we want to broaden that tool so that we can use that to help with additional affordable housing. And we'll have more legislation later this year on that. Our vision for housing, we hope, will meet with Vishaan's Goldilocks framework, which prioritizes smart and sustainable solutions, but also brings into account energy costs and environmental stewardship. And I'm particularly pleased that part of his talk tonight and part of his work is speaking to both climate change and stormwater management. If you want to get a couple of municipal officials really going, get them going on stormwater management. It's something that we're very passionate about. And for all of you here in the city, it's actually easy to see. This summer happened to be dry, but last summer we all remember the chronic flooding. That is our future. And in this part of the country, the way in which climate change is going to manifest itself is more high heat days and more rain. Last winter, we deployed city snowplows once. That is also our future. More rain and more high heat days. Not this September, a year ago September, for the first time in the city's history that anyone can remember at least, we closed schools in September because of high heat. We've had high heat days in June before, but not in September. And most of our school buildings do not have air conditioning. And so we are on a 10-year plan to renovate or replace every school building in the city. And when we do it, we have already signed a decarbonization pledge. And so that all of our new school buildings will be detached from fossil fuels and will have electric heat pumps with solar and other green energy sources. And so we are trying to put our money where our mouth is. We are leading by example, certainly within the state, first city to make that pledge. And stormwater management will be one of the top legislative priorities for the city in the upcoming legislative session, which starts in January, and something that we are deeply involved in. It is not a question of simply building bigger pipes. There are many places in the city where we do in fact need to repair our sewers and make improvements to our sewer system, but we need to integrate into our land use planning and our real estate development plans, stormwater mitigation plans, bioswales and permeable surfaces and stormwater mitigation techniques, because it is not simply a question of catching all of the water in a bigger pipe. That will not solve our problems. And so we're making those adjustments as we move forward. And so it's always a thrill when you find someone that agrees with you, and particularly when he's an expert. And so it's really exciting to me that all of you have a chance to hear from, hopefully be inspired by, and then we'll continue in a collaborative way through PPS with the city, help us move this city forward. As we've said multiple times through our comprehensive plan process and in other public forums, it is not a question of whether we grow or not. It's a question of how we grow. We are growing. We cannot stop that force, and I don't think we should. But we do have the ability to control how that growth happens. And we're trying to do it in a thoughtful way. We're trying to do it in a way that respects the things that make Providence special. That approach is informed very much by the community, by all of you. And it is informed by outside examples and inspiration that we'll hear tonight and in other venues. So thank you very much.
It's such a nice opportunity to be able to, for all of us really, to actually hear a lot of that, hear a lot of the plans underway, a lot of the thinking that's underway, the kind of wrestling with the problems and the exciting opportunities in Providence. And so I also just really wanted to thank Mayor Brett Smiley for your stewardship in the city, the energy, the commitment. So thank you for all of the work that you do. Thanks everyone for being here this evening, for getting to Goldilocks. I also wanted to thank Jacqueline for working with us on this event. And I wanted to thank Sandy Zip, Chair of Urban Studies at Brown, who's also a co-sponsor for this event, and Kari Lang. You didn't think I was going to point you out, but Kari was the one who wrote an article in the Providence Eye that was very focused on your article. A lot of people had read it already, but I also just wanted to say, you know, Kari sort of also brought it into the conversation in a really central way. And I also wanted to recognize Joseph Mulligan, Director of Planning, for being here. Thanks for being here. So I'm Marisa Brown. I'm the Executive Director of Providence Preservation Society. And I have the privilege of introducing Vishaan Chakrabarti, who's our speaker. So if you saw the flyers when you registered, when you checked in, you see that he has a book coming out next week on the 24th. And that book is called The Architecture of Urbanity, Designing for Nature, Culture, and Joy. We did try to get some copies here, but it was a little bit too crushed, and Princeton University Press is very busy. But you got the flyers, and so you have something, you know, if you can order it that way. Vishaan is the founder and creative director of Practice for Architecture and Urbanism. He also serves as the Thomas J. Baird Visiting Critic in Architecture at Cornell. He was a principal at the architecture firms Shop Architects and Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill. He asked me to shorten his bio, but I'm not going to go on forever, but people want the information. He was also, because it's such an amazing and unique range of things that you've done, I think. So he was... he was president of the Moynihan Station Venture at the Related Companies, director of the Manhattan office for the New York Department of City Planning in the Bloomberg administration, and the William Worster Dean of the College of Environmental Design at UC Berkeley. Current projects include the expansion of the I.M. Pei Design Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland, planning and development of downtown Niagara Falls, and the conversion of the historic Domino Sugar Factory on Brooklyn's waterfront, which just opened, and has gotten, for those who read architecture and art journals, it's gotten a lot of really exciting press. So in many ways, I feel like Vishaan is the thinker, I'm going to embarrass you now, the thinker, the designer, and planner that we most need to hear from at this moment, because his work is informed on the one hand by research, by context, policy, huge and kind of very like human sensitivity to the multiple crises that we face, ecological, housing crises. But at the same time, the designs are bold, charismatic, and really beautiful. The Practice for Architecture and Urbanism describe themselves as utopian pragmatists. And as we think about how we are going to respond to the climate crisis, to a dire housing shortage, and the many humanitarian challenges that are a result really of the systems we have built over time, I love that phrase, utopian pragmatism. I think it's exactly what we need, and I think this with the stress on the word utopian, because utopian at its best is really about great architecture, great plans, and the sense of why we love this field and what this field can offer to people. So as many of you know, Providence's comp plan is being finalized this fall. This has generated a lot of healthy and dynamic conversation over the last few months about how to add increased density without losing the connective tissue that makes small historic cities like Providence so special. And we know that connective tissue can be so much easier to destroy than it is to build. A few months ago, Vishaan wrote the article that you have all heard a little bit about. And I think what was really so inspiring about that was the notion of how to kind of create a research-based density that also protects the character of, in this case, New York City neighborhoods and historic districts. So given the conversations that we're having here in Providence, it felt like the right moment to invite Vishaan here to Providence, and we're so glad that he was able to fit us in with his busy book schedule, which takes off next week. In an interview that he did with PPS last week, in advance of his visit, he said, part of why people are so skeptical is that a lot of the 20th century tore down entire neighborhoods and rebuilt out of whole cloth. It was an act of erasure. And to me, what we do now is much more an act of weaving. where we look at what's there and we use this idea of palimpsest, which means the layering of history, where we add new layers without subtracting the old ones. And so you get this kind of rich tapestry of old and new. I love that. And with that, I'm really happy to introduce Vishaan Chakrabarti, and looking forward to the conversation that we all can have after the presentation. Thanks for being here.
I have to tell you, I do a fair amount of this public speaking. You guys win. You just win, right? Like that was the intro to Stop All Intros. I am so pleased and privileged to be here. Jacqueline, thank you so much for hosting us. Mayor Smiley, I mean, do you know how I work with a fair number of mayors across this country? The fact that a mayor shows up to get down and dirty about stormwater management, and not only does that, but does it at an architecture school, this is a very rare thing. So thank you very much. I really appreciate your attention to all of these really important and complex issues. And Marisa, I was telling Marisa earlier that I consider myself a preservationist, but I really consider myself a preservationist, and I think the school of thought that you brought to the table at PPS, which is this notion that preservation isn't about preserving things in amber, but really about how one manages growth and change. And so just the fact that we're having a preservation discussion at RISD, one of the world's great architecture and art schools, that is about looking forward. So we're looking backward while we're looking forward, to me already speaks to kind of the place we need to be in. And so I know this is a talk about Goldilocks, and I should also thank clearly the New York Times because it gets around. But before we get to housing and the nitty-gritty of housing, I want us to all take a step back for a second and think about what it means to think about both history in terms of preservation and the future. And I've not given this talk before, so I was excited to put it together. And you know, in thinking about that, thinking about being here, Jacqueline, you may know this image, or you may know this quote. If you know the Laurie Anderson song, she sings "History is an angel being blown backwards into the future," and she's actually quoting Walter Benjamin, who was looking at a Paul Klee painting. And I love the imagery of this, right? So it's not this 20th century binary of what is historical, what is the future, that we pull history forward with us and all of its imperfections and all of the complexities of what it means to go into the future. And that, I think, in part is a recognition of the fact that all change is scary for me. Change is scary, and the older you get, change gets scary. And so how do we reconcile this in terms of the future that we're thinking about? And you know, I do teach, I spend a fair amount of time with students, and, you know, I think it's really important to understand the context that especially many students live in today, which is this idea that, like, does the future even exist? You know, between social media and AI, I mean, you could put 8 images up here. I've just got, you know, 4, but between social media and AI, the total lack of affordability that they're experiencing and whether they can build the kind of equity that older people have in the society, the amount of social and political division, and then obviously the big umbrella, which is climate change, and what that means for everyone. And I promise this is my most depressing slide. It will go up from here. But it's really important to understand, I think, this context. And I think older generations, that there's almost a cautionary tale if you're not understanding this context for younger people. It is very real, it's very manifest, and it's something that we have to recognize in these debates like housing and housing for whom and housing where. And so, you know, part of what I look to as I have a friend who's an Oxford economist, and I love her dearly because she can draw. And her name is Kate Rayworth, and she, through sketching, came up with this idea. Her book is called Donut Economics. And so what she takes on is the economic paradigm of growth, that we're just going to keep growing and growing and for growth's sake. And so her conception of this is something slightly different, which is that we need to live in kind of this donut. And that if society falls into the hole that's in the middle of that donut, it means that people don't are living below subsistence, right? They don't have enough housing, they don't have enough food, that there's precarity in society. If we live above the donut, right, we are using too many of the planet's resources, and we're leading to all sorts of problems. And of course, the problem we have in our society today is most people are on either side of that, right? There are actually very few people living within the donut. And to me, this is a very important frame for thinking about all the problems that I just sort of laid out on that slide before, and thinking about, well, again, housing for whom, growth for whom. So I think if we're going to think about that, we need to really think about the world. I'm an immigrant. My parents emigrated to Tucson, Arizona when I was 2 years old. And so I have a lot of family back in India. And so the world has gone through certain convulsions that are really important to recognize when we talk about growth and we talk about immigration, which is such a hot topic right now. So these are UN estimates, and the UN has actually revised its estimates a bit downward and basically are projecting that by the end of this century, we're going to plateau as a planet at about 10.4 billion people. And that's come down from about 11 and change. And that the majority of those people, since about 2007, the majority of those people live in cities and suburbs. And that the rural population is actually sort of on the decline and then gonna again level out. And so these slides are important because, again, they set the frame for things like housing demand, especially as it pertains to immigration. And you will hear conflicting data about this that I want to clear up because I think it's important to clear it up. Some people will say, no, we're not actually growing that much. There's not that. Population is declining in wealthier nations. We are not having what's known as replacement rate, kids to replace the population. In most of the developed economies throughout Western Europe, in the United States, there are some countries like South Korea that are really well below replacement rate to the point where it is become an enormous political issue. But don't let that mask the larger trends, right? Which includes the fact that the continent of Africa is still growing at a very significant rate. India is still growing, but leveling out. China has basically leveled out with the one-child policy. And, as an Indian, I will tell you that, something I've experienced firsthand, my father is from a very rural village in northern India, that, people have more kids when it's an agrarian society where people are poor and women have fewer rights. As those things change, people have fewer kids. And so clearly that's something that we need to work on because, the nations up there that have like a lot of population growth tend to also be the ones that overlap with slavery and colonialism. So that's not an accident. There's a reason that we have the population growth that we have. So this is very important in terms of climate change, but it's not maybe what you think. So I remember, I think it was around 2007, 2008, when the world hit 7 billion people. And there were a lot of articles and a lot of hand-wringing, especially in the West, about all these people, climate change, how is this going to work? All these people having babies. The issue is that the polluters aren't where the population is, right? So these two graphs, and again, this is UN data, they're almost the converse of each other. If you look at carbon emissions per capita versus where the population growth is occurring, you will see that it is the wealthier nations that have much slower rates of population growth that are polluting the most. And in fact, I know people in Africa who are talking about Africa having the potential to be the first net zero continent for a bunch of different reasons. So it's much more complex than more people equal more carbon, right? And so we need to think about that because otherwise there are some really strange xenophobic and misanthropic kind of tendencies that can come from this discussion. So I think it's really important to start at that high level. Now we can get more granular. So this is data, fairly recent data from UC Berkeley that shows, well, that high carbon emissions per capita that is, say, in the United States. Well, if you drill down further, where is it coming from? So what's really interesting about this data, and I'm sorry, Providence is just off the map. It's not my fault. It's some Berkeley scientist's fault. But what you notice fairly clearly is inner cities have low carbon emissions per capita because people use mass transit, people walk, People also live in apartment buildings. Apartment buildings, for the architects who are out there, you know that single family homes are terrible thermal envelopes, which means that basically apartments heat the apartment above them and cool the apartment below them. Single family homes are just terribly inefficient by comparison. What's interesting is the rural data, where you would imagine that when people have to drive such long distances, that there'd be a very high carbon emissions per capita rate. I've driven cross country 6 times. And what you really come to understand is that there is an extraordinary conservation culture. People have less money. They don't hop in their pickup truck to go get a quart of milk. They think about that trip and they use those resources very wisely. So where does that leave the culprit? It's all the stuff in between. And when you get granular with this data, it's housing, it's cars, it's landscaping equipment. That's one that really threw me when I saw how bad landscaping equipment is for the environment, right? And so this is where the problem is. And that problem comes from design. So one of the things, and I was so happy to hear the mayor speak the way he does, because I find that many people, present company excluded, who are our political leaders, don't necessarily understand the relationship between the design of our environment and policy. And we have to remember that we designed these things. So the suburbs are a fairly new invention, largely kind of started in the UK, really exploded here after World War II and the passage of the National Highway Act in 1956. We did a series of things as a government. We said we wanted to decentralize the population. We passed the mortgage interest deduction, which is still the biggest housing expenditure that we have as a society, that says that a married couple with a $1.1 million mortgage can deduct the interest on that from their taxes. You know, the UK dropped it, the Netherlands dropped it, nothing happened to the housing market, right? You know, it's an extraordinary public expenditure. And there were other things, the GI Bill, right? The Highway Act. And of course, there was all of this racial underpinning to it. There was redlining of mortgages. So in the beginning, and I'm not calling every suburb a racist now, so it's just the asterisk, okay? But the underpinning was extraordinarily racialized. And so there was this notion that only certain families could live in these places. And then in the 1990s, we doubled down. We said, oh, so I grew up in Arlington, Massachusetts, in a house that looked very much like the one in the upper left. We drove cross country, right, 4 of us in a Dodge Dart, and it was fine. But somehow we've decided that to drop our child off at school, we now need that. Which was changed under the CAFE standards in the Clinton era to revive the auto industry. And so now we've legalized trucks. So these policy decisions have massive design implications and vice versa for our environment. And it's all subsidized. It's all subsidized. So when people tell you we don't have the money for housing or mass transit, it's complete BS. We've just chosen to use that money in a specific way. And this is not, by the way, a red or blue issue. I started talking about this 10 years ago, and I found a lot of like frozen faces in blue audiences as well as red. And the other thing is we're not going to solve that problem, that 20th century technology of the suburb, through green tech. The idea that we can then put solar panels on and have electric cars, the amount of land degradation, loss of forest land, all sorts of things, the threat to farming that happens from more and more subdivisions is a disaster in terms of the environment, even if you use batteries and so forth. And in fact, the CEO of Ford just said that he's going to stop making electric vehicles, at least for a while, that are the size of that black car because of the size of the battery that it needs. Because it's still power. It doesn't, it doesn't just sort of magically float ethereally because it's electric, right? And we have to think about the size of these things. So again, going back to this thing about the size of population growth. I mean, that is a small village in Africa. That's someone's home in the United States. They are the same scale, right? Because somehow we've decided that 2 people living in a house need 6,000 square feet. these are also at the same scale. That's a highway interchange in Los Angeles. That's the central district of Florence, the historic district. So we do this funny thing. We live this way and we go on vacation there without thinking twice about the scalar implications of designing a place for the contradictory goals of speed and safety. So the car never has to slow down. God forbid the car has to ever slow down. And this had enormous, and Secretary Buttigieg talks about this, had enormous, again, racial and class implications that, in my worldview, led to a lot of the political division that we have in our country today. These are the same exact shot in Detroit, right? So for these highways to come from cities to go to rich suburbs, they had to go through or largely African-American, Latin American communities of color that are still suffering from high childhood asthma rates and all of these things. And we think nothing of it. We drive through it. We think it should be free. We think it should be there for us because it's some manifest destiny that we get to live this way. And the mayor mentioned surface parking lots. This is Detroit. The car has all of these spatial implications in the inner city as well, not just the highway. Parking, as an urban architect, I spend an untold hours trying to figure out parking in American cities, right? Because there's 8 freaking parking garages all around your site, but everyone needs like a space right next to the building. So let's build a new parking garage. And so it's like tooth decay. Right? Detroit was an incredibly dense, vibrant city. And this just happened over time where, I work all across the American Midwest and every city's kind of figure ground now looks like this, right? Because we've done this for the car. And now we've spread it. By the way, the American dream was never about a house and a car. It was about equal opportunity for every citizen. James Trussell Adams, 1931, never had anything to do with material goods. Changed after World War II. And then we spread that as an idea of success all around the world. So since the 1990s, 2 billion people have entered the middle class. I've seen it in India, Turkey, China, all over the world. And they have adopted that definition of success. So now think about the implications to the planet if we go from a few 100 million people who live this way to billions, right? I mean, so now you can go to the desert outside of Riyadh and you will find the same suburban subdivisions that you find outside of Phoenix, right? Irrigated, right? But the problem is we're not doing much better with our cities either. Our cities are expensive, they're homogenous. They're increasingly, and as a New Yorker, I fear for this in my own city, they're increasingly feeling like the same blue glass tower with the same Starbucks in the bottom, and you don't know what city you're in anymore. And so we've got to kind of just hit pause for a minute and think about not just building and not just growth, but think about how to grow and what's the goal of the growth in terms of having a more positive vision for a future. And I think to do that, you have to look backwards. You have to look into history. And so this is in the book. It's this really fun fold out. It's kind of hard to read here, but this is a select history of urban form since antiquity. And so the pandemic was the ultimate test. When the telephone was invented, people asserted that we don't need cities anymore. We can live on a mountaintop and we'll all do work that way. I read a hysterical article when the fax machine was invented about how this was going to undo cities. The younger people in the room have no idea what a fax machine is. We live in collective circumstances, not just because we barter and we need them for economic reasons. We have to confront the fact that we like each other. In culture after culture, we have built collective communities for cultural and spiritual reasons as much as we have for economic reasons. And the fact that, post-pandemic, Providence has a growing population and all sorts of cities have growing populations tells you that even with the advent of remote and hybrid work and all of these things, you can't get a restaurant reservation in New York City. It's like, you can't, because people want that joie de vivre that comes from being with each other in diversity and culture and so forth. I like to talk about that condition, that cultural condition, as the idea of urbanity. Now, if you look up urbanity, it's really interesting. I bet if I say that word for most of you, it conjures kind of two sets of things. One, the idea of big cities. The other that I hear a lot of, and actually it's in Merriam-Webster, that urbanity is about like city slickers. It's about like the cosmopolitan, right? So it's the elite. I find this very funny. I think of urbanity as grit, right? And I think of it fundamentally as what I call the positive social friction of difference, right? And so to me, it has nothing to do with size. You can have an urbane small town. You can have a big city that's not urbane at all because it's so segregated. And by the way, so in our office, we use these multicolored dots to represent people, not just to indicate ideas of racial difference or religious difference, but also difference of mindset. And I think that is incredibly important when we talk about diversity, that yes, of course, race, religion, creed, those are critical ideas of gender, critical ideas of diversity, but so is mindset. And so one of the, like people say, well, why do you say urbanity instead of communities? Communities are a tricky thing. I love the idea of community, but community can also be very, very self-protective, right? And so, to me, that is the diagram of the difference between communities and urbanity, where you have to step outside of your comfort zone and look eyeball to eyeball with people who are different than you. Not just maybe look different or dress different or have different skin or pray differently, but think differently. And that is fundamental to me. Public space in the city especially is the antidote to the media, the social media bubbles that have siloed us, where we have to confront difference and understand that it's not so scary after all. It's actually kind of fun. And so, yes, it can be Japan has these series of farming villages where farmers live like this, right? That is a very, very rural village, right? It wasn't this Jeffersonian idea of everyone living on their own plot of land. My father's village, rougher than that in India, but still same idea. That's Schitt's Creek, if you recognize it from the television show. And that's, of course, Hong Kong. So urbanity can manifest at all these different scales. And I think one of the most important aspects of it is this idea that people can co-opt space to their own ends, not just what it's designed for, right? And so this transcends architecture, right? And it's about the way people use space in real urban places in all sorts of interesting and weird ways. The McCarran Park pool in Brooklyn, that's an empty pool. That pool doesn't have water in it, right? And so when the city stopped putting water in it, a community group got together and said, let's use it for concerts, right? Famously, and there was a TV show that showed this, a lot of the maids in Hong Kong are Filipino, of Filipino descent. And on the weekends, they hang out under Norman Foster's HSBC tower in central Hong Kong. So this extraordinary kind of juxtaposition of high culture and low culture. Urbanity, and I'm very interested in this topic, I think has a huge connection to public health and mental health. We have a loneliness crisis in our society, and technology is fueling that. And so if you read this great book called The Good Life by Waldinger and Schultz, it's the longest study of human happiness it's been done at Harvard over multiple generations. And basically what they find is if you control for all the variables like smoking and all of that stuff, that what leads to longevity and human health is the strength of your social connections, which leads me as a designer to think, how do I design places that encourage social connection among people? Because we design a lot of things that are segregated. Rural America went from main streets that were decimated by shopping malls, and then e-commerce and big box came and decimated the shopping malls. And so we went from main streets to malls to meth. We've given people no place to be. So how can they have the strength of social connection? So to me, there's a very strong connection to public health. And then this is actually a diagram from an Indian architect who redrew this Greek city planner's work, Doxiadis, who talked about, this is well before our nomenclature of blue people and red people. But the Doxiadis theory was that in less dense environments, every once in a while, someone who is an innovative thinker is born. and doesn't find a lot of commonality with the people around them, and so starts moving to denser circumstances until they finally find enough people like themselves, these kinds of change makers, that they start changing people around them, right? They become sort of contagious. This could be a diagram of the Arab Spring, right? It's part of the reason that you see the kind of foment. I mean, if you look at the streets of Tel Aviv right now, right? Those streets were not meant for, they're meant for cars, right? But why are all of those people there? They are trying to instigate change. And that's where you go to instigate change. And so it's very important in terms of this idea of progress. So in talking about progress, and this is an architecture lecture, but that background is very, very important to me because it's for me personally kind of the why I participate in this field. This field has a very bad history with a lot of the stuff I just described. The field was very complicit in segregation, and then it became complicit in this stupid architecture thing about building spaceships in the sand built by slaves and thinking that that was the definition of excellence. And so I talked to a lot of students about this. What's interesting is these are all Pritzker winners, the highest award in architecture. And the Pritzker committee has done this sea change, this complete 180. Because now all of a sudden there is this recognition that maybe what the venerable need to do is work with the vulnerable. And so there are different forms of urbanity. That's Alejandro Aravena's half a house project, where poor people get half a house and then they can build out the other half of the house the way they see fit, which is telling you that Alejandro doesn't really care about the perfect aesthetic outcome at the end of that process. Balakrishna Doshi in India, his housing, and Lakatan and Basal's, I'll show you more of that project. It's a remake of a social housing project. And Francis Correa in Africa. And so this is Anne Lakatan's project. This is an extraordinary project. This is a Tower in the Park public housing project where she worked with the residents to convert the facade and give them more space, but also create this kind of liminal flexible space. It's been wildly successful because it was done with the people who live there. Tatiana Bilbao also working again with this idea of modularity and change with residents in Mexico City. O'Donnell and Toomey, this is the low-income housing project in Dublin. Michael Maltson, who does a lot of work with the unhoused in Los Angeles. I mean, this is groundbreaking architecture. It's just there to serve a different purpose than, some MBS fantasy in the desert. And then beyond housing, Grafton's University in Lima. I'm just going through these quickly because I think it's important, especially since we're standing here in RISD, to talk about things that inspire me in the field beyond my own work, and also just to set the stage for maybe people who know less about architecture, that there's a lot of really interesting things going on, right, that have to do with building in our cities. This is this beautiful mosque that Marina Tassabaum did in Dhaka that's also a community center. You see it's raised above the flood zone. And then also Gurmat Sian in London, a community garden with that big monumental arch. And then a self-taught architect who's a friend of mine in a refugee camp in Uganda. And I know this looks like a simple amphitheater, but there are 5 different ethnic groups that use this refugee camp, and getting them to do cultural things together was very, very tricky. And so this is going on at all scales and all sorts of different scales of habitation. And I find it great. There's also much bigger examples that mayors are doing. The tram car in Medellin, many of you may know about the bus rapid transit in Bogota. We saw what Anne Hidalgo did with the Olympics, just extraordinary, just shared city bikes. And then so in some of our work, we've been this thing of, I know many of the preservationists in the room know the term adaptive reuse, and we'll talk about adaptive reuse of buildings. But I think of the term much more broadly. I think of adaptive reuse of cities. So I'm not one to really participate much in building new cities from scratch. I think that's some weird tech billionaire fantasy. To me, the much more important thing is, how do we think about and build with the exquisite complexity of our existing cities? And one of the biggest things are roads. So we built these massive roads for all the history that I talked about. And there is absolutely an ability, so this is in New York City, to reuse roads for mass transit, for new forms of public space, for for everyone from toddlers to senior citizens. And again, there are examples of this in Dallas. They've decked over a highway to build that park. In Madrid, a much more expansive version of that. And then some of the most extraordinary social housing that's going on in Europe, in Paris, in Berlin, in Vienna, including the inclusion of migrants, which is really quite something in a city like Vienna, because Vienna is actually politically autonomous from Austria. And so it can do things like that despite the far right in Austria. And so all of that, now we can talk about housing. All of that brings me to the fact that our vice president is calling for 3 million new housing units. Kind of extraordinary to hear a presidential candidate talk about housing. Something you might be a little less familiar with is the fact that Senator Warren, Elizabeth Warren, who's sort of taken Kennedy's spot as the liberal lion of the Senate, she's got an extraordinary housing platform that includes the ability to override, it's like a little asterisk on page 471, but like the ability to override local zoning if communities are going to be anti-housing. And so I find this politically fascinating, right? That suddenly we have a YIMBY presidential candidate, and YIMBYism, for those of you who don't know the term, yes, in my backyard. But the real question this raises for me is, given the history of the federal government in our housing policy, both on the side of suburbanization and on the side of public housing towers that didn't work out that well for a lot of the residents who had to live in them, what 3 million homes? Where? What kind of homes? And yeah, I'm going to ask the audacious question that people might think is completely frivolous. What do they look like? You know, because experience matters. People take care of things they love. So what are we talking about building? And how are we going to weave the politics of it? And I think in more progressive places, we're going to have to confront what many people have started to talk about quite openly, which is that if we've got a conservative party that's saying that the country is full, we've got progressive cities saying that the city is full. And so that's become quite a famous image, that one on the right, because of the inability to kind of see the contradictions, you know, in terms of not wanting new housing in one's neighborhood. So this is where our office comes in. A lot of the examples I showed you were international examples. These are the utopian pragmatists of which you spoke, Marisa, an extraordinary group of people. And there's only about 25 of us. You know, we came out of the gate about 10 years ago talking about, and for the architecture students in the room, this might be of interest. The first thing on our website had no imagery. It just said what we do and what we don't do. And we kind of spelled out from the beginning what we weren't interested in participating in, which made our lives in some ways a lot easier. Everyone in my profession thought I was completely batshit crazy. But we formed a set of practice areas around things like, I call it social housing. It's a different thing in the United States than it is in Europe. Cultural and educational facilities, public infrastructure, workspaces, and then this idea. I was very honored that the mayor called me a thought leader. I really believe that all good professions have to offer thought leadership to the world, not just what they do as professional practitioners. And then this last but not least thing, which is the process of co-design, of working with people, not just for people or on behalf of people, but really with people. And with communities. And so we are very much about the existing, as I said, this idea of adaptive reuse. And so we look at place like most good architects do, and, you know, kind of what constitutes place, the needs of the city, the client, the community. And through those things, we try to forge the idea of connection at the scale of construction, which is kind of the individual scale where you interact with a building or design project, you know, sort of one-on-one. At the community scale, the urban scale, and then climate and the global scale. So I'm not going to do a big sales pitch about our work. We do a lot of different kind of work. It's all urban. We don't work for dictators. We're not interested in any of that kind of stuff. So a lot of our work is in the industrial Midwest, a lot of it's in New York, one strange project in Mongolia, which I want to talk about, this would take too long. But it's quite an array. We feel very lucky about it. Marisa mentioned dominoes. I'm gonna get to housing, but I wanted to talk first about urban experience and urban change, because housing comes into that conversation. You can't talk about new housing without talking about the experience of it. This is an adaptive reuse project. I've been working on this for almost a decade. I don't know if any of you have heard of it or been there. This is the Domino Sugar Refinery. It's an 11-acre site on the Brooklyn waterfront. It has 4 communities around it: an Orthodox Jewish community, an African American community, a Latinx community, and a kind of hipster community. And those 4 communities never interacted. I went to the site very, very frequently. This was an old sugar refinery. The sugar refinery moved to Yonkers and to Baltimore. This is Domino, the little yellow packets of sugar. And so it's a long story about how our client got ownership of the site. But the first thing he did is he hired us and a very, very talented landscape architect named Lisa Switkin from Field Operations to design this park. This park is magnificent. It is what Frederick Law Olmsted called a social condenser. It brings people from all walks of life together. My favorite place is the playground, because when I see kids from those communities, and as I said, Orthodox Jewish community, communities of color, I think about Gaza. I think about the fact that, maybe because these kids play together, they'll think about the world in a different way. Sorry, this always makes me cry when I think about it, because it's like really important. So that's what the site looked like. It is a city landmark. It's a factory. It's a kind of object of desire for a lot of New Yorkers. It was designed as a factory. It was designed in 3 pieces. None of the windows lined up. Sorry, I skipped a part. After the park, we were commissioned to put a creative office building into this old factory. None of the windows lined up. And it didn't have floors in it. So for the preservationists in the room, I think you'll find this a really fascinating story. We had to do this drawing to explain to the New York City Landmarks Commission that the facade was basically fake. It was a series of windows that didn't describe anything behind it other than sugar refining equipment. And if you know how sugar is made, you'll never eat it again. It's the most disgusting thing, like something like charred lamb bones. It's really anyway. So as the client called me and he said, look, we have all these issues. The windows don't line up. We can't get light and air into the building. We can't strike a floor across the building if the windows don't line up. So wheelchairs can't get across it. And I said, the only thing you can do is design a building inside the building, like a bottle inside a ship. And so that was the sketch from the phone call. And then we went to the Landmarks Commission. And part of why I'm focusing on this story is I really believe that in our craft, we have to tell stories. We have to craft a narrative for why we want to do what we want to do. It's not good enough to say, I want to do this because it looks good to me. I'm the artist and it looks good to me. No one cares, and nor should they. This is about research. It's about understanding and reading place. So this was the historic condition of the building. As I said, this is where you can see that it had no floors, it had these windows that didn't really relate to anything. And there were these steel tiebacks that held up the facade. And so we proposed this bottle in a ship by saying the new building would insert in the old one with a new system of steel tiebacks. So it will snow and rain in this space. And that space exists today. And Lisa planted 25 pin oaks in the space. Which is really, really extraordinary. And so when you're in the space, you are looking through the biophilia out these vignettes into the city. And so to me, I constantly think about that history as an angel being blown backward into the future thing when I think about this building, because it is about both the future and the past and everything that sits in between. We had enough air rights that we were building above the factory. So again, for the preservationists, a lot of American preservation, I think this is changing quickly, but for a lot of American preservation, the idea was we shouldn't see the new thing. It'll destroy our understanding of the old thing. European preservationists don't think this way at all, right? You go to Berlin, you go to Paris, that's not at all the modus operandi of preservation. Here, we had this very good, healthy conversation with the New York Landmarks Commission. And one of the things that we wanted to pay homage to is you see those brick windows there, those arch windows. The reason those are there, and I bet they're on a lot of buildings, industrial buildings in Providence, is they're a fire retardance device. See, it used to be that there was a wood lintel that held up the brick above the window. Factories had fires. When the fires took place, they would burn the wood lintel and the entire building would collapse. It happened on this site. So the American round arch style was developed, right, to eliminate the wood lintel. And we just thought that if there's ever something to pay homage to, it was that. And hence the barrel vault form was born. It was also a very structurally efficient form, made the floors column free, it made the foundations very logical, and off we went. And so now it sits on the skyline, and it sits on the skyline with a bunch of much taller buildings. But under the Bloomberg administration, I was very involved with the High Line. And to me, the two projects are very similar for New Yorkers because, again, it's this thing of saying, we know our city's changing, we know it's growing, but can we pull history forward with it? Can we pull our narratives forward with the change? You know, and that's what people recognize in these projects, is that this thing cannot be anywhere other than where it is. It would make no sense. You can't transplant it. Always focus on the first 30 feet of the buildings, how it meets the ground. There's a very porous system we've developed. We work with Landmarks Commission to build that out. And so there'll be a lot of retail and cafes and bars that will soon be spilling out from the building. They're not open yet. And then the upstairs has become this really extraordinary exhibition space. All sorts of events are held there. There've been fashion shows, community events, concerts. It's really pretty glorious up there. I'm going to go through one or two other projects before I get to the housing article. So we were the recipients of something called the Miller Prize. I don't know, have anyone been to Columbus, Indiana? Excellent. It's a long story, so you can look it up, and there's movies about it. Columbus, Indiana is a small town in central Indiana where Irwin Miller, who was the CEO of Cummins Engine, and his wife, Xenia Miller, were architecture buffs. And they hired Elio Saarinen, the older Saarinen, to do the first Christian church. That's a Henry Moore. Across from that is the public library, which is the IMP building. So this little town in Indiana probably has the best collection of 20th century modernism that you'll find anywhere in the country. It's a pilgrimage site for many architects. And as they got older, they set up something called the Miller Prize, which was to allow younger architects to build there. And so we won, they just called us one day and said, you're a recipient of the Miller Prize. They give you some money and they give you an assignment. And our assignment was to help revitalize downtown. And this goes back to the whole road diet thing. We went out and talked to a bunch of people, high school students, anyone we could talk to, bought a bunch of people ice cream to sort of figure out what people needed downtown. And we realized that it's kind of like a one stoplight town. And the city engineer, we got him really high on ice cream. And he realized then that he didn't need stoplights, that he could do it with stop signs. There wasn't enough traffic. And so we proposed this canopy structure over the main intersection in town because people sometimes were already closing that intersection for different kinds of festivals. So the mayor, this is Mike Pence's Indiana, the mayor's like, I don't know, like bucks can go under it, Mary, it'll be okay. And when we showed these drawings to the community, the Miller Prize is set up as a temporary installation. The community said, we want this to be permanent. So we had to raise a bunch of more money to let it take snow load in Indiana, and we had to build it in we were the general contractors, we built it in about 5 weeks. It's just nylon tent structure, but it sits in this, I wanted to show this because it sits in this extraordinarily important historic fabric. And yet is this simple thing that is actually in some ways kind of barely architecture. There it is during a festival, there it is in an Indiana snowy day, and it's become an Instagram place, it's become a place of a lot of festivals. And to me, this is the most interesting part about it and why I wanted to raise it. There has been Pride Week, festival after festivals happened here, all these ethnic groups, some of whom are related to Cummins Engine, some of whom are not. It's quite a diverse town for a small town in Indiana. And the number of these groups that have told me they never felt an invitation to downtown before this structure was built. Right? So I'm going through this because I think it's really important that if you're going to think about building housing, housing isn't widgets. It's about building a neighborhood. It's about building community. And that means inviting people of difference to come and celebrate in that space. So the density around public space becomes important in this regard, right? And that's one of my an architect's favorite quote, whatever space and time mean, place and occasion mean more. That now we're going to move into architecture a little bit and the idea of context. This is a project, a big project at Princeton being donated by Melody Hobson. Is right in the center of the campus. It's very sustainable. It's cross-laminated timber, all of this stuff. We designed it to work with a network of episodic courtyards that are at Princeton University. And so the landscape is very important around the building. But what I really wanted to get to is the facade, because again, we're going to build 3 million homes. What are they going to look like, and how are we going to think about that? Princeton's a very historic campus. They're very, very sensitive about what gets built on that campus, as you can well imagine. And so we did all this analysis of historic buildings, modern buildings there. There's a lot of pressure to build something that looked like Hogwarts. We weren't going to do that. We ended up picking this very beautiful Danish brick that, Dutch brick that emulated the local stone. So the brick is highly variegated, even down to the mortar color, the terracotta, those really beautiful cover tiles that we're using for the roof, all to channel the you heard the word palimpsest before, this idea of layering history. And so this is an unequivocally contemporary building. But in its scale and its material language, it's trying to lock itself into its context. And so for those of you who know, like postmodern history, when architects were trying to do this by doing just historical looking buildings, right across from this is a modern historical looking building that looks like Hogwarts. And we were not going to do that. And so this has proven to be a very popular design with the Princeton community. This is actually, it's interesting because the subtext of this building is get people out of the eating clubs and into more egalitarian forms of living. Anyway, I just wanted to show this because I think it's a very detailed study of how facade can change this. Moving now to housing. This is in one of the poorest parts of New York City in East New York. It's a 2,200 all affordable housing project, from moving from formerly homeless, formerly unhoused, to what's known as workforce housing, teachers, nurses, firefighters, because that's the problem we have in our city. We need to subsidize through government subsidy housing for people who actually make reasonable incomes. The site is owned by a pastor, an extraordinary man named Reverend A.R. Bernard. He has a congregation of 30,000 people. That's his church, the thing that looks like the baseball field, the blue diamond in the middle. And this was the first sketch. It was all about creating a destination, extending the street grid into the site, solar access. Reverend Bernard had read his Jane Jacobs and knew about the poor, mixed-use density, small blocks, mix of old and new, and lots of entrances. And so, we developed a site plan around those principles. Buildings are actually shorter than some of the buildings in the context. Local council member was very, very focused on brick. It's interesting to think about brick is that it's one of the few building materials that's the scale of the human hand. So that's why you see it again and again. The lower buildings are actually home ownership units. That is a curbless street. So those are things that you find, in images of Copenhagen and like rich parts of the world. It's not typically what you find in East New York. This housing was very, very well received. And this is low budget, affordable housing, right? And so it takes work to get something that looks like that people will take care of and feel like that is my entrance, right? And that's something that belongs in my neighborhood. And it is, again, working with people to understand that. And so mock-ups are going on. This project which was largely motherhood and apple pie with the community, took 5 years of public process. And it will be 8 years between when it was proposed and when the first family moves in, which is bananas. It's completely bananas, right? That's our system. And that again, oh, this is more construction. That again is this issue we have, especially in our more progressive communities like New York, where it feels like, and they're all well-intentioned, it's all well-intentioned. But whether it's the city council or the state legislature, the solution to every problem seems to be adding another regulation. Right? And that cannot be the solution to every problem. And the fact that it took that many years for that project to get approved is what inspired the famous article that was referenced before, where the Times called us. We've done a couple of things in partnership with the Times. It's been a great collaboration, where they said, what do you think about this housing shortage? You know, and it gave us the opportunity, gave me the opportunity to think about a question that I've had for a long, long time, which is what's the capacity of New York City from a design and character perspective, not zoning, not policy, but from character. And so we worked on this for 6 months. And what was extraordinary, they ran this on January 7th of this year. They ran it online at the end of December. They ran it in hard copy on January 7th, which I was blown away by. They put it on the front page of the opinion section. And so this was the core question. I've wondered this for years. How do we meet our housing needs as a community without changing the fundamental character of our neighborhoods? If you know New York City, you know that we are a city of neighborhoods. Most cities are cities of neighborhoods. And this is all, you know, I hear this, all of us have heard this who work in this field for decades now. You're changing the character of my neighborhood when you build that. What does that mean? And how do we test the limits of that? So we came up with this article, and basically we tested a bunch of prototypes, and we used a methodology that I'll describe. We used the city's database. We plucked out all of the sort of weird sites. So sites that were either vacant or had like a one-story store on them. So no housing displacement, number one. That was rule number one. Rule number two was it had to be within a half mile of mass transportation, because obviously we want to build transit-oriented density. Rule number three, and this was quite a conservative rule, we stayed completely out of the most conservative floodplain of New York City, which you can build in a floodplain, but we didn't want any third rails. We wanted to avoid as few darts being thrown at us as possible. So we said, we're going to avoid the floodplain altogether. We found over 10,000 sites. Together, they are more than twice the size of Central Park. So one of the things that's so interesting about this, and maybe you have a corollary to this here in Providence, is people see a kind of city with lots of buildings and they say, oh, the city's full. It seems like it's full. There's a lot of buildings. And certainly people would think of that of New York City. New York City has plenty of open land, surface parking lots. There's surface parking lots in Manhattan, some of the most valuable land in the world. And so then we said, okay, how are we going to do this analysis? And we said, okay, there's sort of from a construction standpoint, there are 5 different kind of prototypes, right? There's the single family house. There's this townhouse scale, which I call Goldilocks. I'll talk about that more to close out. There's block and plank construction. That's that East New York project I showed you. This is a fairly affordable form of construction. Maxes out about 15 stories. High rise at 30 to 50, and then skyscraper technology, which is taller than that, and is usually reserved for luxury condos because it's so expensive. So what we did is we knocked out the first type and the fifth type, and said we're not going to really look at those single family houses. There are single family neighborhoods in New York City, but purely bad for the environment, as I've laid out. Skyscrapers, just luxury. So we have these 3 kind of baby bear, mama bear, and papa bear. And then we said, okay, so how do you define neighborhood character? Well, it usually is a conversation about height. So we said, okay, forget the zoning. We're just going to say for any given site, any building we propose cannot be taller than something that's within an 800-foot radius of it. So the tallest building in an 800-foot radius. In busier sites near lots and lots of mass transit, we extended that radius to a quarter mile. But basically said you can't be taller than the buildings in your neighborhood. the tallest building in your neighborhood. And then we did these visualizations, these before and afters. So this is a transit-oriented single-family neighborhood in the Bronx. And we pegged the height to the ridge beam of that house right there, the two over to the right from the site. And we proposed a 6-unit housing project. This was the one that was the most controversial, interestingly enough. And I'll explain more about that in the next thing, the Goldilocks thing. In Brooklyn, again, transit-rich neighborhoods, that red building, it's a 1-story grocery store. And we said it can't be taller than the buildings around it. That's a 58-unit block and plank building. And then in Queens, a very transit-rich neighborhood with a lot of density, similar thing, 1-story building where we proposed a 250-unit building that is poured-in-place concrete. Obviously, we took our time trying to design these so they look like something. They're not just white masses, and they're trying to feel contextual in some way. And contextual is a complex conversation in New York City. And then the last thing we did look at is office to residential conversion. Unlike Providence, we have really big blocks in New York City, very hard to convert these big, deep buildings. We looked at it. It's tough. It's expensive. It's really tough. And so then we did a tabulation across those 10,000 sites. And we found 520,000 units. That's enough to house 1.3 million New Yorkers. So we've had this migrant crisis. We've had more than 100,000 new New Yorkers enter the system. We have over 100,000 people sleeping on the streets, including lots of children. And so it's fairly clear to us that we are not out of land. What's interesting is the preservation groups love this article because we never touched any of the historic districts. There was a companion article that said tear all the historic districts down, which was crazy. Guess who hated this article? We had so much positive response. Neighborhood groups, civic organizations. There's one group that really did not like this article. The real estate industry, the big real estate industry. I was shocked. I'm like, guys, you got an architect working with the New York Times identifying sites you can build on, and you hate us for this? They have no interest in building 60-unit buildings in Queens, which is probably very different than your real estate industry here. But to me, this is just fascinating. And what it spoke to was the need for a different kind of building. For smaller scale builders, often, I think, from underrepresented communities, women, people of color, not what you think of as the typical New York real estate developer, which we have a pretty strong idea of what that person might look like. And so that's been a fascinating conversation. And so we've been talking to state and city legislators and City Hall and the governor's office about this. So, and thank you for your patience. I know this is a lot of information, so I really appreciate it. I'm going to close with, I said, getting to Goldilocks. So what's Goldilocks? So housing is a real fascination. And look, I love towers, but I realize that towers just aren't the right thing for lots and lots of places. It's also, if you really think about the places people love in cities, and these places exist all over the world, Shanghai, Boston, there's any number of places where there's this scale. So what's interesting about that is I started asking myself a question, and this was for the folks at TED. We know how to build a carbon negative single family house. That technology exists today. The problem with it is it's operationally carbon negative in terms of, if you just look at the carbon that the house and its residents consume. As soon as you add in the fact that you've got to drive everywhere, that carbon negativity becomes basically meaningless, right? We do not have the technology today to do a carbon negative tower. Do not believe the hype. There's a lot of really good technology in the work. Windows that are solar panels, mass timber construction, biologically based concrete, lots of really cool, interesting stuff. None of it's at scale. It will be at some point, but none of it exists today. What's interesting is the middle scale, why it's called Goldilocks. We know how to build that scale of housing, and it's got a lot of roof area. And so what's interesting is it's gotten just enough roof area that in most sunny climates, and it was interesting what the mayor said about Providence. I grew up in Boston where there was constant snow. The idea that there was one snowplow day, it's just amazing. But like all climates are sunny climates at this point, in most of the latitudes. And this scale of housing, which we know how to build, has enough roof area to produce more energy than the residents consume. Now, excuse me, for those of you who are carbon geeks, I'm talking about operational carbon, not the embodied energy of what it takes to build the building. That's a whole other exercise. But what's interesting is this isn't a design, it's a prototype. So in some climates, you'd build it out of 2x4s. Some places you could build it out of light steel construction. Other places you'd build it out of brick. And it is not about height. So a lot of people said, well, why are you limiting yourself to 3 stories? So Paris, that's probably like the 5th or the 6th there in this month. That's some of the densest housing in the world, right? And that's the Los Angeles version of the housing. The problem is that most of that housing in Paris and Barcelona is illegal by today's codes. It's a 7 or 8 story walk up, which is not allowable under a wheelchair code. If it has an elevator, it's this little cage elevator, which doesn't meet fire code, doesn't meet wheelchair code. So we have international building code that precludes us from building that kind of density. And so this is the diagram I use to explain that of what happens past that sweet spot of 3 stories. So what the code says is, if it's 3 stories and you have wheelchair accessible housing at the lowest floor, you don't need an elevator, and you can build what's known as a single stair module for the housing geeks, which means you don't need 2 sets of fire stairs as long as firefighters have big enough windows that they can get into the upper floors using their ladder. And so this is a very important piece of code analysis, because what it says is you can get a density of about 48, 50 units per acre, which is quite dense. Urban density will support mass transit without a lot of concrete, at a fairly low construction cost, and a communal single stair, which if you go to Rome or Tel Aviv or Mumbai, you'll see all of these buildings that are built around, where apartments pinwheel around one staircase. You know, if you haven't seen your elderly neighbor for a while, it's a much more communal form of living and building density. But you can make it deeply environmentally sensitive in terms of what technology you put in it. Again, all known, understood technologies, composting. But most importantly, nice apartments, you know, spacious apartments with light and some sense of community to them. And so what's interesting is if you take 330 residents, you can house them like that. Or at the same scale, you can house them in a tower, but we don't have an ability to make that truly carbon negative. And it's not the right scale for a lot of places. Or you can do the thing in the middle with a courtyard and the mayor mentioned stormwater. There's a lot of things you can do with landscape around that kind of a setup. So we tested it in 2 places I love, Calcutta and New York City, and looked at 2 different sites with, again, 2 different manifestations, a wood manifestation and a brick manifestation, one around a street wall condition, one around a courtyard condition in India. And we felt like it did pretty good. That actually this was housing that you could imagine weaving into a single family neighborhood and weaving in with lots of different material expressions. We have a weekend place in Bellport, Long Island, which is very anti-density. So I proposed this. It's also very, very segregated. So I proposed this near our train station and tried to find the most diverse entourage I could find to put in the rendering just to piss people off. So you can say, so I'm going to just really truly close now. So you can say, well, 3-story housing, like what if we're going back to the beginning of the lecture, if we're going to a world of 10 billion people, what's that going to solve, right? You'd be amazed. If all 10 billion of us lived at that scale, we would barely scratch the surface of the earth. The earth is very big, and we need a lot of it for agriculture. We need a lot of it for untouched forests. So if we just live at a slightly higher density, right, we can preserve most of the biodiversity on the planet, most of the things that we really, really care about in terms of what we call nature. So that's an extraordinary statistic by itself. And it leads me to, I started with a lot of pessimism, I closed with a lot of optimism in terms of what we could do, right? We could build an economy, this is building off of Kate Rayworth's work, right? Where we don't just talk about jobs, jobs are important, but I think people in the future are not just looking for jobs from their environment, they're looking for a sense of environmental and social justice, and they're looking for a sense of joy that comes from experience. And this is where I think design plays such a critical role. And so what I'm advocating is what I call this idea of connective design, where every building with a decision about where you put a door, a loading dock, a canopy, those decisions all either invite people or shun people, right? And so it's really quite granular, right? But it leads to these larger ideas of diversity, positive social friction, joy, nature, and culture. Nature, culture, and joy. And that is what I advocate for. So thanks for hearing me out. I really appreciate it. I'm happy to just field them. You want to, oh, are we up there? Okay, we're going to go up there. Okay, let's do that.
I think everyone would have you could have gone another hour.
Okay.
So.
I started to see some drooping out.
Well, that was really incredible, Vishaan. Thank you so much. And as I'm looking through my notes, and most of the questions I was telling Marissa are going to be really focused on maybe have a pedagogical turn or a way in which we think about how this applies within pedagogy or the academy or the way students think through this. And something that I found really fascinating in your position around storytelling and narrative making was also the ways in which you leverage the tools of the disciplines that you engage: architecture, preservation, urban studies, art practice, planning, can think through ways to translate research into the narrative of a vision to bring people along. So I'm curious for you how you work within the team of your office to maybe uncover a little bit of your research methods, how that translates into kind of how you structure, let's say, a project or a team to move towards kind of a clarifying thesis, or how you can think about how you best communicate with an audience, whether that be a community, a governmental office, a person within a position of power, etc.
No, I really appreciate the question because it's very much at the core. I have wonderful, wonderful people, and I like to say that they're all Swiss Army knives because we look. It's a very challenging thing to ask someone who studied architecture or urban planning. Almost all of our people are architects. To, in addition to the extraordinary challenge of becoming a licensed architect, going through architectural school and internship, to also be a storyteller. But I'm quite insistent upon it. You know, we went through a period for the older architects in the room, you'll know what I'm talking about, where we as a discipline seem to take joy in butchering the English language. And I will not participate in that. I was telling Marissa earlier that you know, I studied, I had this great winding way of ending up being a dual major with art history when I was in university. And it's kind of one of the most useful things. Like people don't think of art history as like this really practical, useful thing. But what it actually is it's a discipline where you have to explain visual things to non-visual people. And that's what architects spend a lot of their time doing all day. You have to be able to construct a story. And I go back to this thing of like, you can't just tell someone, especially, so part of why people like love doing those spaceships in the sand built by slaves is because no one asks them questions. There's no community board that is allowed to ask them questions, right? And so they can have this, you know, the number of architects from whom I hear this, well, I just hate the bureaucracy. I mean, bureaucracy, you're building in people's communities. Like, what do you mean bureaucracy? Like, we're not sculptors, we're like, you know, like, sure, beauty and the things that we can, like, so to me, you know, if I think about a surgeon who's also a thought leader in public health, right? She has her tools of the trade. She's going to talk to other surgeons about how they do surgery well. That's not the conversation you have with the public, right? You're having a public health conversation with the public, and understanding those modalities is really, really important. So you can't just walk into a community board meeting and start talking about, you know, window wall systems, right? And expect everyone to either follow or care. So that idea of narrative, I think, is really important, because what are cities but are a sort of built manifestation of our stories? That's wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. My question's about social connection. And I wanted to ask how I can see how that obviously is a core part of your practice. And as you were sharing your work, I was wondering, as a non-architect, non-designer, how can policy help with that? How can community organizations help with that? How can community members at an individual level help with that? How can people who are not designers kind of help kind of construct those places of social connection?
I actually think in a lot of ways, non-designers have more to do with this than designers. Designers are left with the kind of end stage process, especially with landscape architects. You know, we're left with or architects, we're left with the end stage process of what the powers that be have decided, right? In terms of what housing is going where, what density, where the infrastructure is going. And so often we have to, I mean, I've been part of a group of people in New York City that has been trying to fix the embarrassment that is New York Penn Station for years now. I mean, for those of you who come from Providence, you get to go through Moynihan, but most of the commuters go through the existing unsafe, undignified hellhole that is Penn Station. And talking to politicians and business people about this is like hitting your head against a brick wall. And like, I try to say to them, we're at a post-pandemic moment. We're trying to get our commuters back. We're trying to, you know, like, you don't think this is important? And, you know, they get that it's important, but that it's just really complicated. And so connecting the dots between a design imperative and social connection is like, really, that's what this book is about, but it's not obvious to people, right? And the last thing I'll just say on this in terms of policymakers and decision makers is cars. It doesn't matter if it's electric or autonomous or ride share, none of that matters a hoot. All that matters is that they are tin cans that segregate us, right? That's all that matters. It's a spatial and material condition that leads to a cultural condition. And so the death by 1,000 cuts, right? Of, like I said, where the loading dock goes, where the curb cut goes, the number of times where there's a space between two buildings and a developer or even an elected official will say, we can put the auto drop off there, you know, like the circular driveway in front of like the Marriott. And you're like, we're in Philadelphia or Cleveland. We're in one of the great places in the universe. I'm going to include Cleveland. And like, really? And so it's that death by 1,000 cuts, right? That is constantly the fight about, say, that little corner of space in the city can be a place of social connection, right? And it's like planting a garden, you know, you just have to give it some air and some light and just let it do its thing. Right, which is why I showed that Columbus project. It's just a stupid canopy, right? But it's just enough to get people to do the thing that they just naturally do as our species does, right? Convincing people of that is often really hard. And the funny thing about that is it's not an economic issue. it's a weird, like, idea we have about convenience. Right? That's about cutting sidewalks into little bits so a car can drop off. Like, it's that stuff. And it drives me nuts, right? And so.
Yeah, questions from the audience we should take? Yeah, I also just want to say, it just feels to me, I don't know, people in the room, like this presentation just opens the door for a lot of common conversation where sometimes in Providence, people think that they have different opinions and views about the future of how we want our cities to be. And I feel like you have opened the door to a place that is where there's a lot of common ground. And that in a way that's also kind of creative, but also, research got you there. But I feel like that's really resonant beyond tonight in Providence. So I just wanted to thank you for that. Yeah, questions? There's mics traveling around. Questions, anyone?
The talk was wonderful. Thank you so much. One of the things, this is very nitty gritty to Providence. The Goldilocks idea of keeping height low. We have in our planning, if you put retail on the first floor, you get another floor. In this city, we have a lot of empty retail that's not being filled. So it's not working, and yet we're going high using unused space. It continues to happen in the, it's not going to change in the comprehensive plan, at least not what I've heard. Could you give us an opinion on that? And please.
No, thank you for the question. First of all, I don't mean to imply that Goldilocks is necessarily the right solution for Providence. I mean, I think it's probably too low a scale for downtown Providence. And again, for the folks who are real, like, carbon hawks, I will have this argument with you all day long, right? Preferably with some tequila around. Because people will say, well, you can't build that building out of concrete. It's too much embodied energy. And I'm like, if you're talking about building in a city with infrastructure, we're going to have to do that. That is not, to me, the decisive measure. And so I'm betting in a lot of your sites in downtown Providence, you can take more height. That 3-story height, it seems to me, is probably more a next ring of urban density height. And it's interesting. I don't know if it's as true in Providence. Certainly, in the outskirts of Boston, Somerville, Cambridge, you find that density in a lot of places. The thing about the retail and getting I'm generally a pro-density person. I think more density leads to more urban activity, more safety, lots of good things. The retail question is a really interesting question right now. And this goes back, I think, to two things. One is it's not a widget thing. In other words, a standalone building that suddenly it's gone taller because it's got that retail bonus. The thing is, if it's basically an island, that retail, of course, isn't going to work. Retail has like really kind of strict rules around it about what retail works. And you can all conjure this in your heads, right? The retail that's on tighter knit shopping streets where it's been planned to be, right? Then that tends to work because it's a pedestrian environment. Otherwise, you're asking it to be destination retail. Someone has to go out of their way to go there. One solution to that I don't think we've looked at enough is so this whole the thing that planners have instituted in zoning codes about retail on the ground floor, it again comes from very good intention. It's about activating the streetscape, right? I think we need to broaden our horizons about what activates the streetscape. Like, so maybe you don't want residences down on the ground floor, although in some cases, like the East New York project, I showed stoop housing, where you elevate by a couple of feet, and there's a lot of cities that have great stoop housing. But there's also the opportunity to put social infrastructure on the ground floor. So that project I showed for Reverend Bernard, most of the ground floor, there's a grocery store and there's a convenience store. The rest of it is 24/7 daycare because he's got congregants where people work fast food at night and they need a place to drop off their kids. Vocational training, there's all sorts of other activities that can activate the streetscape other than a CVS, which ain't such great shakes. I'm not sure that's what Jane Jacobs was talking about when she wrote about mixed use. And so we need those things in our society. So if the developer is getting that bonus, maybe the developer can help to fund some of that social infrastructure, right? But we desperately need those things. And the last thing I'll say, those are destination places, a vocational training center, a daycare. Those are places that people will go out of their way to go to. And so I think we just have to expand that idea of what ground floor activation can be.
Stephen Pryor, exceptional presentation. I'm
Thank you, sir.
surprised. I happen to have some experience with Vishaan Chakrabarti. Well done. Question, in the broader topic of adaptive reuse, speaking specifically of buildings, commercial to residential, there's a lot that's been fomented at the federal government level around some relatively modest incentives to achieve the commercial office to residential conversion. You've shown us multiple examples in things less exotic than Domino with all of its complexity. Are you starting to see some design solutions, especially around light and air and some of the other things that are constantly brought up as profound challenges that can help us as commercial office really is in decline worldwide and we need more residential?
Yeah, I am. And I was talking to your mayor about this earlier. All the solutions I see, Stefan, in bigger office buildings, bigger floor plate buildings, a 40,000 square foot building, 50,000 square foot building, floor plate. Sure, there's always something you can do. It never seems to make sense to me. Like it's just too expensive. And I think the question for a policymaker is, if you're going to do a tax incentive that's that deep, is that the best place to spend public money? And I would think probably not. We live in a capitalist society that believes in creative destruction, and some of these buildings are going to go. I mean, there's a new JP Morgan Chase headquarters going up in Manhattan that did take down an old 1960s office building because the ceilings were just too low. They recycled the building, but to me, the key is, and what I learned is that Providence has a lot of smaller blocks. And so those smaller buildings, and this from our experience together in Lower Manhattan, the 1930s, 1940s buildings, smaller floor plates, operable windows, much, much easier. And then the thing I heard that some landlords are offering incentives to move their tenants out of Class B buildings into Class A office buildings, into those larger, newer buildings, because the Class B buildings are more convertible. That sounds like a home run to me. That sounds like really good, smart policy that maybe you want to incentivize in some way. But look, if you do have smaller blocks and therefore smaller footprint buildings as a city, you are so lucky compared to a lot of the cities I see, which again, as you go out into the American landscape, these are cities with very, very big blocks. So they built really big buildings on them. That's really tough stuff. That is very tough stuff. And I think at some point those buildings are going to end up getting torn down because the surgery it's going to take to make them into housing, I don't think is going to be worth people's while. I could be proven wrong, but I have yet to see solutions for those buildings that make a whole lot of sense. And by the way, if you want to follow an interesting story about this, London just went through this with one of the big buildings that was built in Canary Wharf. And they are doing a residential conversion. It's extraordinarily expensive, and Canary Wharf is desperate. So I don't know.
You talked about death by 1,000 cuts, so maybe we can talk about like healing by 1,000 band-aids.
I love it.
I'm one of the landscape architecture students in the room, and I was wondering if you could just give us a little insight about the ground connections at the Reverend Bernard building and how you're kind of also bringing in landscape to and help as you're building more housing, how that is being treated.
Yeah, we're really blessed. We work with wonderful landscape architects. We have very collaborative relationships with them. For that particular site, that's again a big stormwater management site. It's near Kennedy Airport. It's not that far from the harbor. And so there's quite a bit of softscape to absorb water, and also green roofs to absorb water. And for us, it's in a city like New York, you're constantly trying to you're trying to define urban rooms. And so it's really the landscape architect and the architect working together, that unless it's a big waterfront park like Brooklyn Bridge Park, which, Michael Van Valkenburg can go to town and build some romantic homesteading landscape. Most of the stuff that we're building for housing their courtyards, they're smaller pieces of public space, but are really, really important in terms of both social connection and things like stormwater management, which have become a huge issue in New York City. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but it's really case by case, and it's quite granular, right? And a lot of it depends on the landscape architect and what they think.
Thank you. Personally, that was an absolutely spectacular and inspiring and thought-leading presentation. So thank you for that.
Thank
you. Really amazing. So Providence is a smaller city where the public transportation is not so robust. And there are, I suppose, something of a difference in the population between those who really don't need cars or don't want them, and those who actually have cars and need them. And we have so we don't have as far as I can tell, a way to get rid of the car, as I know you would like to see in your planning. And the question, but now our comprehensive plan has proposed the ability to build a building with 75 units that has no parking at all. And in the neighborhoods where actually there is no parking, so this is going to either consign itself to be housing for people that don't have cars or don't want them, or it's going to be somehow not useful in the neighborhood. So I'm wondering how you think about that in cities that are not New York, where you actually have, or where people actually don't have a car, you can't afford to have a car, basically, you couldn't even find a parking space. But so what do you suggest for our city and for that kind of a plan that says, well, you can build these big buildings, they don't have parking spaces?
So a couple of things. First of all, you're not alone. It's not a New York City question anymore. This is cities across America: Nashville, Kansas City, San Antonio. They're all confronting this challenge because they're all densifying. One of the things that happened post-pandemic is we did see a drop in population in the big expensive cities around the country: Boston, San Francisco, New York. We saw a big uptick in smaller cities. It sounds like Providence is experiencing this as well. Some of which had started pre-pandemic and really accelerated in the aftermath of the pandemic for affordability reasons, a bunch of other things. Companies moved. And so there's this constant problem. Most of the developers I know don't want to build the parking. It's very, very expensive. I think it's a terrible use of land. It's a terrible use of concrete, which is a big thing. Like, we need to use concrete judiciously, going back to the other conversation. And look, I have a 22-year-old who doesn't have a driver's license, right? I don't think he's ever going to get a driver's license. I think younger people are much, much less focused on having a car. There are many European cities where you see people well into their 70s and 80s going grocery shopping on their bicycles. Like there is a shift going on. And the thing is there's always, with this kind of cultural shift, this question of the tipping point and where the tipping point is, but the tipping point's not going to come until you try it, right? And so that that builder's gonna build that project and people are gonna move in, I bet. And I bet those people won't have cars and they will figure it out. And they will figure it out more quickly than I think we probably have the imagination to understand how quickly it will work. The thing though, that's I think the most important aspect of it is once that happens, they are gonna put more pressure on the system to have more amenities within walking distance. Right? And so it's a chicken egg thing. Right? And so I don't know what comes first, but I think it's the development project without the parking garage, in terms of the chicken and egg. And like, again, city after city that is not New York, not San Francisco, not Boston, is confronting this same exact issue. The other thing I just say is the road diet thing. You said that the mass transit isn't so great. Most of our cities, including New York, are not going to build tons of new subway systems. It's way too expensive, right? We have to think about our existing road bed and how to better use it, right? And, for truly protected bike lanes, for protected bus rapid transit. And that gets to the last part of that the last thing I'd say to your question, which is, there was a very famous mayor in Bogota, Colombia, who said a developed country isn't a place where poor people have cars, it's a place where rich people take mass transit. Right? And so famously, Mayor Bloomberg took mass transit, and as you know, he's got a couple of bucks, right? Like, this in too many cities, I see bus and light rail systems that are only frankly used by the poorest people in the city. Right. And so it reinforces stereotypes about crime, about people of color, about all sorts of kind of like 1950s segregationist stuff. Right. Just take the bus. It's not that hard. Right. Like it's really not that hard. And the more, and again, it's the chicken or egg thing. The more people do it, the more bus service there will be, the more there will be a coffee shop at that bus stop. Like it's just, there's a natural accretive quality to that you have to just start taking part of it, and having faith in.
Thank you. We have time for one more. My name is Susan, and I want to thank you for your presentation. It was amazing. I want to say just really quickly a comment about during COVID. My one panic, I was only inconvenienced, I did not suffer, nor did anyone I know, but I had a moment of panic when I thought that, oh my God, there aren't going to be people making the things that I need to be made and providing the services that I need to have. So that was my sort of urbanization moment. And at that time I was living in suburban New York. What I want to say about what you presented today was that it was pretty wonderful. And so therefore, the more is expected of you. What can be done to influence the real estate industry to be responsible? Because it has run rampant for so long. I understood completely when you said who was the one pushback, and I said real estate because they are kind of pretty awful. And what can be done to get more design responsibility and leadership involved in the way real estate and on several levels, real estate just runs off the rails.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I'm going to try to answer really quickly. I think there's a huge policy opportunity here. I was speaking to former Deputy Mayor Vicky Bean, who was the Deputy Mayor under Mayor de Blasio. They had policies to promote create small business enterprise, to create new developers, smaller developers, younger developers, again, people from underrepresented communities. And I think I think if people have to build in their community and they have to walk by the people that they are, building for every day when they're dropping their kid off to school, they're going to have a very different relationship with that community than someone who lives in a tower 2,000 miles away. Right. And so, I think that is so integral. And I think there are ways that policymakers can actually really support that kind of small business creation. Real estate is a difficult industry. It's a high risk-taking industry. It needs a lot of patient capital. Government can be the source of that patient capital for certain kinds of developers. But there has to be then a quid pro quo with communities. So for instance, you say if there's smaller scale developers and it's, call it smaller scale housing, like some of the Goldilocks stuff I showed. Maybe there's a way to streamline regulatory processes for those people, right? And in those kinds of environments, right? So that, you know, because one of the reasons big developers and a lot of unsavory characters thrive is we've made so many regulatory hurdles. We've made it so difficult to develop that only people who can hire high-priced attorneys and can really like ride out years and years of land being undeveloped and not making any money on that land are big developers, right? So that is, I think that, so you said a lot's expected of me, I agree, but a lot's expected of communities as well, right? And so there has to be some other social compact around how development occurs. And also there is a history of nonprofit developers, you know, NGOs, churches, right, who've also acted in schools have an opportunity because of the amount of land that's around schools. So we need to think about this differently. We clearly don't have all the people we need in the marketplace to build the housing that we want. And I think it's one of the big impediments. So I really appreciate the question.